Welcome back to all of Freddy's children. It's story time with your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian. Tonight, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Protege, Chapter 14. As the El Dorado started to spin, Brent really wished he'd put on his seatbelt. He grabbed hold of the door handle to steady himself and pressed both feet down against the floor. He had no idea how effective either of these actions would be should Pat's Camaro slam into the silver El Dorado, but they were all he could think to do, so he did them. Pat whooped with delight as if he were riding a particularly wild roller coaster. He eased off the gas, much to Brent's relief, though he didn't hit the brakes. Illuminated by the Camaro's sole remaining headlights, the other had broken when Pat rammed the El Dorado for the second time. Jerome's car spun several times before sliding off the road and into a ditch. Pat slammed on the brakes then, and the Camaro's tires screamed as the car skidded to a stop. Silence hit Brent's ears like a physical force, and all he could do for a moment was sit while his heart fluttered in his chest like a tiny, terrified bird. "Come on, asshole! Let's go see if we got him!" Pat turned off the car, though he didn't remove the keys from the ignition. He punched a button to turn off the Godsmack CD, then threw open the driver's side door, leaped out of the Camaro, and started running as soon as his feet touched the road. Brent didn't want to get out of the car, didn't want to see if they'd gotten Jerome. It was one thing to make fun of a dork like Jerome Starkey. After all, the freak practically begged for it. But it was another thing to intentionally try to kill the guy. Brent knew Jerome had killed Eddie, and he thought that he'd shared Pat's outrage over Eddie's death, along with his need to avenge it. But now that he was here, sitting in the middle of the road on the outskirts of town, heart pounding, listening to the ticking of the Camaro's engine as it began to cool, all he wanted to do was go home, crawl in bed, and pretend this day had never happened. A fist pounded against the passenger window, making Brent jump. He turned to see Pat looking in at him, his face a mask of anger and impatience. "I said come on!" Pat's voice was slightly muffled by the window glass, but his message came through more than clear enough. Get your ass out of the car or else. Brent knew there was no way he could avoid this, so he opened the car door and stepped out onto the road with weak, shaky legs. Pat, of course, was standing right there waiting for him. "That's more like it." He grabbed Brent's arm and started hauling him toward the spot where Jerome had run off the road. At the moment, as he was running to keep up with Pat, rubber-soled shoes pounding on asphalt, fat gut joggling, night air sliding in and out of his lungs like quills of ice, Brent wondered for the very first time in his life just why the hell he hung out with Pat Cottrell. He was surprised and more than a little saddened to realize that he really didn't have a good reason. Couldn't, in fact, remember the first time he'd become friends with Pat, if indeed friends was the right word for what they were to each other. It seemed like he'd always been one of Pat's sidekicks, and always would be, as if he'd been born for no other purpose than to fulfill that role. He wondered if Eddie had felt the same way about being Pat's friend, wondered if he'd had any regrets before he died. He figured there was at least one thing Eddie had regretted, not running fast enough to get away from Jerome Starkey. And Pat was leading him right to Jerome, and there was nothing Brent could do about it. The El Dorado had stalled out when it hit the ditch, but the car hadn't flipped over. Brent didn't know if that was because the spin had bled off some of the El Dorado's momentum or what, but aside from a few minor dents, the car looked to be in reasonably good shape. The El Dorado's headlights were still on, though they were shining upward at a slight angle. The engine ticked loudly as if small pieces were spontaneously snapping off inside, and the air was filled with the rich stench of hot rubber. Pat still had his pin light, and as they drew closer to the El Dorado, he pulled it from his back pocket, turned it on, and aimed the beam at the driver's window. There was no sign of Jerome. "Maybe the bastard slumped over onto the seat or something," Pat muttered, still gripping Brent's arm with his free hand. Pat stepped closer to the El Dorado, Brent accompanying him step by step. When they were close enough, Pat leaned forward and peered through the window. Brent didn't take a closer look. Seeing Eddie dead in the alley that way, head pulped to a mess of blood, bone and brain jelly, had been enough gore to last him the rest of his life. But he needn't have bothered holding back. Pat straightened and said, "He's not in there." The passenger doors cracked open. I figured he must have got out that way. He shone his light around searching for some sign of Jerome, but there was none. It was hard to tell in the dark, but Brent figured that Jerome had ditched his car in front of a property owned by a farmer. There was a chest-high rusty wire fence on the other side of the ditch, with weathered gray posts. On the other side was a grassy field dotted with wheels and patches of bare earth in numerous places. Brent was no country kid, but he figured that this was probably a field where some kind of animals ranged. Cows, maybe, or sheep. They'd probably been scared off when Jerome ditched the Eldorado and had retreated to the far side of the field. This wasn't good. If animals ranged here, that meant a farmhouse was probably close by. Close enough, maybe, for someone to hear the accident and call the cops. Even then, Springwood's finest might be barrel-assing toward them, pedals pressed firmly to the metal. "Pat, I think we should get out of here." He hated how small and frightened his voice sounded, but Brent couldn't help it. Pat still had hold of his arm and gave it a painful squeeze. "What the hell are you talking about? We got Starkey right where we want him." "Really? That's news to me." Brent whirled around at the sound of Jerome's voice, just in time to see the edge of a plastic eye scraper coming toward his face. He tried to bring up his arm to block the blow, but he wasn't fast enough, and one of the scraper's sharp tips caught him on the face just below his left eye. He shrieked with equal measures of pain and fear, and stumbled backward, hand reaching for his injury. Warm crimson splashed onto Brent's fingers, and he pressed his hand tight to his wound. A Midwestern little Dutch boy trying to plug a hole in a dike of flesh, but with far less successful results than the original. Blood gushed past his fingers, ran down his cheek and chin, dripped onto his neck, and oozed beneath the shirt collar. Grinning, Jerome stepped toward Brent and brought the eye scraper back in a reverse slash aimed at his throat. Brent's gaze locked onto Jerome's, and what Brent saw there, or rather didn't see, chilled him to the core of his soul. Jerome's eyes were dull, blank, dead. They contained no hint of emotion, no sign of reason, nothing that Brent recognized as remotely human. They were less alive than an animal's eyes, for even the most primitive of animals displayed some sort of life, no matter how small or simplistic their brains might be. But Jerome's eyes might as well have been fashioned from plastic for all the life they held. They were doll's eyes, mannequin's eyes, the eyes of death itself. Brent knew he had only a split second before the sharp tip of the eye scraper bit into his throat and laid open his jugular. Reacting completely on instinct, Brent allowed his legs to go limp, and he started to slump toward the ground. As he fell, the eye scraper nicked the top of his head, and he felt the plastic cut open the skin and scratch against the skull underneath. Fresh blood poured from his second wound, and a patch of his scalp flapped in the night air as he collapsed to the road surface. Without conscious thought, he curled into a fetal position to protect himself, squeezed his eyes shut, and lay still. He heard Pat scream, "Goddamn motherfucker!" Then he sensed Jerome step over his shivering prone form to confront Pat. A wordless impulse hit Brent then, haul ass. Brent didn't waste time debating whether or not it was a good move, and he certainly didn't feel any guilt at the idea of abandoning Pat. After all, hadn't they both ran off and left Eddie when Jerome had fought back in the alley? It was every man for his fucking self, right, Pat? Brent rose to his feet and started staggering toward the rusty wire fence, wiping blood out of his eyes as he went. Behind him he heard the sounds of Pat and Jerome fighting, but he didn't turn around to look. He didn't so much as slow down as he leaped over the ditch and began climbing over the fence. Halfway over he slipped and fell, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of himself, but he'd made it over the fence. He climbed to his feet once more and started moving again, wheezing as he fought to draw air into his lungs. He had no idea where he was running to, and he didn't care, as long as it was away from Jerome Starkey. Pat saw Brent get up and make for the fence, moving like a drunk with a severe inner ear disorder. He wanted to shout after him, denounce the fat bastard for the fucking traitorous coward that he was. But Jerome was coming toward him, grinning like a maniac, eyes cold and dead as a shark about to sink teeth into its prey. And Pat no longer had any time to spare for thoughts of Brent's betrayal. He was too busy trying to stay alive. Jerome stepped forward and slashed out with the ice scraper. Pat leaped backward, arms up, spine curved inward, and the scraper hissed through empty air. The scraper was a small handheld tool with a plastic head and yellow rubber grip around the handle. If Pat hadn't already seen Jerome wield the scraper to deadly effect against Brent, he would have laughed at Jerome's choice of weapon. But now he respected the ice scraper as if it were a finely sharpened blade of high-density steel. A wild thought occurred to him then. It's not the size of the tool, but how you use it. It sure as shit was true in Jerome's case. He'd cut Brent good with the fucking thing, But Pat didn't intend to give Jerome the chance to do the same to him. He turned and started running like a son of a bitch toward his Camaro. As his feet pounded on the asphalt, he imagined Jerome right behind him, eye scraper raised in preparation for his next strike. Pat imagined the feel of a sharp plastic point cutting into the back of his neck, parting flesh and muscle, exposing the stacked ridges of his neck bones. When he felt the eye scraper hit, he wondered if he'd pissed himself. Would he end up dead like Eddie, a mutilated corpse with a urine stain on the front of his jeans? He'd covered half the distance to the Camaro, but he didn't dare glance back to see how close Jerome was. Doing so would only slow him down, and it would be a hell of a good way to catch a pointed edge of the eye scraper in one of his eyes. Damn it, life wasn't supposed to be like this. Sure, Jerome was a freak, had been ever since kindergarten, and probably from the day the bastard was born. But while he demonstrated the occasional flare-up of violent behavior, the episodes had never lasted long, and they'd never been as intense as this before. Pat, though he never admit this to another human being, was scared of Jerome. Had been since the fucker had given him the wound that had become the scar on his forehead. That was why Pat always made sure someone else was around whenever he approached Jerome. Why he'd befriended Eddie and Brent in the first place. So he'd always have someone watching his back just in case Jerome should snap again. Someone to make him feel safer when he taunted Jerome, and maybe even one day to help him kick Starkey's ass, assuming Pat would ever work up the courage. Jerome's attack on him in detention, followed by Eddie's murder, had finally given Pat the courage to confront him at last. But courage, along with his surviving sidekick, hadn't been enough, not by a damn sight. 3/4 of the way to the Camaro, and Pat was glad he'd left the car door open and the keys in the ignition when he jumped out. He was going to have to get in quick, fire up the engine, and blaze the hell out of there before Jerome caught up to him and started to slice and dice Pat with his makeshift weapon. Almost there. He reached the Camaro and threw himself into the driver's seat. He grabbed the door handle with one hand and yanked it shut, while turning the key with the other. The Camaro's engine roared to life, and Pat locked his door, then the passenger's. Only then did he risk turning and looking through the back window to see where Jerome was. At first he saw nothing, and he feared that Jerome had somehow passed him, circled around the car, climbed in, and crawled into the back seat. Any second, and Jerome would jump up and slash Pat's face with the eye scraper. But when Pat looked down into the back seat, he saw that it was empty. Confused and frightened, he looked up and gazed through the back window once more. He spotted Jerome then, standing not far from the ditch to El Dorado, exactly where he'd been standing when Pat had taken off running. Not only hadn't Jerome given chase, he hadn't moved so much as a single step. As fast as Pat had run, as scared as he'd been, Jerome hadn't been behind him at all. Pat figured it was too dark out for Jerome to be able to see him inside the Camaro, especially with its tinted windows. But Pat nevertheless had the impression that Jerome was well aware that he was looking at him. Jerome sneered then, and Pat knew precisely what message the son of a bitch was sending. You ran from me. Ran like a scared little boy. Pathetic. Pat slammed his palm onto the steering wheel in frustration. Jerome no longer needed to touch Pat to humiliate him, and the fact that Pat knew this just made it all the worse. He threw the Camaro into reverse and hit the gas. The car's rear end whipped around until the front was pointing directly at Jerome. He was now illuminated by the Camaro's single, unbroken headlight, as if it were a mini spotlight trained on him. Jerome stood relaxed, eye scraper held at his side, still sneering. Pat gripped the steering wheel tight and pressed the gas pedal a couple times to rev the engine. I'm gonna park on your face, spin my tires, and grind that goddamn smug expression right off, Pat said. He threw the Camaro into drive. Tires burned rubber as the car leaped forward, its engine roaring like a hungry animal eager to sate its bloodlust. The Camaro crossed the short distance to Jerome within seconds, but even in that short a time, Pat had managed to get the vehicle up to 40 miles an hour. And just as the Camaro's front bumper was about to slam into Jerome's legs, he leapt to the side, and suddenly there was nothing between the Camaro and the El Dorado but air. Pat didn't have time to put on the brakes. He didn't have time to cry out in fear and frustration. Didn't have time to do anything except close his eyes, grit his teeth, and hold on tight to the steering wheel as his car reached the edge of the road and its front wheels became briefly airborne. An instant later, Pat had good cause to regret his dislike of seatbelts when the front of the Camaro smashed into the side of the El Dorado, and Pat's forehead came in brief but violent contact with the windshield, and everything went black. Jerome rose to his feet and brushed dirt and gravel off his shirt and jeans. He regarded the twisted mass of crumpled metal that had, until only moments ago, been a pair of cars, but which now looked like a couple of gigantic and poorly designed accordions trying to make love. Jerome climbed down into the ditch and walked over to what was left of the Camaro's driver's side window. The safety glass was spiderwebbed with cracks, but still remained in the window frame. Jerome pounded it with the eye scraper, then peered inside to check on his good buddy Pat. His face was a mask of crimson, but he was moaning softly and stirring in his seat. Not dead, then. At least, not yet. Jerome figured Pat wasn't going anywhere on his own steam for a while. He'd keep. Jerome decided to leave Pat and attend to other unfinished business. He walked around to the Eldorado's driver's side, opened the door, and popped the trunk. He then walked around to the rear of the car and looked inside. There, held in a pair of small brackets next to a spare tire mounted on the side of the truck, was a tire iron. Jerome tucked the eye scraper handle first into the back pocket of his jeans, then reached out and removed the tire iron from its berth. He hefted the metal object to get a feel for its weight, and then swished it back and forth several times to get a feel for wielding it. It'll do, he decided. He started walking toward the fence. Brent ran through the dark. Above him the sky was dotted with cold, bright stars, but they provided little illumination to see by. The moon was the thin silver of a crescent, its light a pale yellow-green, and no help to him either. He couldn't see the ground beneath his feet, could only feel it as he ran. It seemed like he was running across solid shadow, and he couldn't escape the feeling that during the next step he took, or the one after, his foot would come down and touch nothing, and he'd find himself falling forward into darkness, tumbling forever downward through an endless black void. His pulse thundered in his ears, and every gasping breath he took felt like white-hot knives stabbing into his lungs. He was carrying a lot of extra weight, and he wondered if it was possible for a 17-year-old to have a heart attack. Sweat poured off his body and mixed with the blood oozing from his scalp wound before running into his eyes, making them sting and obscuring his vision even further. Brent was by no means religious. He'd attended Sunday school as a child at Christ United Methodist Church, but only because his grandmother had insisted on his going, and his mom and dad, who near as he could tell believed in nothing except cable TV and cheap wine that came in a box, hadn't bothered to protest. So Brent had suffered through boring lessons about Bible stories, none of which he remembered by Monday, dressed in itchy clothes that his grandmother got him every Christmas and birthday, and which he only wore to church, and then only because she made him. So when his grandmother finally died, Brent no longer had to get up early on Sundays and suffer. On the way home from her graveside service, Brent had said his last prayer. Thank God I don't have to go to church no more. And that was the last thought he'd really given to matters that were religious. God, I'm really, really sorry for all the shitty things I've done in my life that I let Pat and Eddie talk me into. I'm sorry we left Eddie's body lying in the alley, and I'm sorry that us picking on Jerome got him so mad in the first place. I'm sorry that I let Pat talk me into riding shotgun while we chased Jerome. Hell, I'm sorry for just about everything I ever did in my sorry excuse for a life. But please don't let me end up like Eddie. Please keep Jerome from finding me. If I get out of this alive, I'll go straight to the police and tell them everything, I swear. And then I'll... A shape loomed in front of him, black against black, outlined by the stars that it didn't block. Brent screamed and tried to veer around the shape, but he was moving too fast, and his feet slipped out from under him. He fell onto his side, and he felt a sharp, fiery pain in his ribs, and he knew he'd cracked one or more, maybe even broken them. He raised his hands in a gesture of either warning or supplication, perhaps a bit of both. Don't hurt me, he sobbed. Please, please don't hurt me. He waited for the dark shape to say something, but the sound it made then wasn't human vocalization. It was low, deep, resonant, and it sounded, for all the world, like... The cow turned and started trotting away from Brent, lowing nervously as it sought to distance itself from the strange, noisy interloper that had invaded its home. Brent lay on his side and watched in disbelief as the animal hurried away. A cow! Jesus Christ! It was just a fucking cow! He began to laugh in relief. But then Brent realized that a new shape was standing over him. This new silhouette was human, and it held something in its hand. something that looked uncomfortably like a tire iron. "What's so funny?" Jerome asked. Brent's laughter died, and a few seconds later, so did he. The throbbing in his head was what finally brought Pat around. He just hurt too damn much to remain unconscious. And it wasn't just his head, his wrists hurt too. He glanced down, and though his eyes were reluctant to focus, he saw he was sitting amidst broken shards of window glass, and that somehow the seatbelt had become wrapped around his wrist during the accident. No, not wrapped, he realized as he saw that the seatbelt strap had been looped through the steering wheel. Someone had used the seatbelt to tie his wrists together. Sudden panic hit him, and he turned to Brent and held out his bound wrist. "Get me out of these!" He trailed off when he saw that Brent no longer possessed anything remotely resembling a face. Someone had buckled a seatbelt around him the normal way. He sure hadn't done it himself, and it was the only thing keeping Brent's body from falling forward and smacking the bloody ruin where his face had been against the dash. Pat tried to pull away from the corpse of his friend, the second that he'd seen today, but he was bound too tightly and could only move a few inches toward the door. The rest of his memories returned then, following Jerome in his Camaro, forcing him off the road, then trying to run him down, seeing the son of a bitch jump aside at the last instant, and then the Camaro slamming into the ditch to El Dorado. He must have passed out after the collision, and while he'd been unconscious, fuck, that's what he got for buying a classic car. He should have gotten a newer one with airbags. Someone tapped on the driver's side door, startling Pat. He turned quickly, setting off a fresh wave of pain in his skull, and saw Jerome looking at him through the open area where the window glass had been. "'Bout time you woke up. I thought you were going to be out all night." Jerome's tone held a cold mockery that shrunk Pat's balls, but he forced himself to sound unafraid. "Untie me right now, you fucking freak, or I'll—" "Do what?" "There's no teacher here to help you like in detention. You're all alone. Unless you count the incredible faceless wonder over there." Jerome nodded toward Brent, but Pat didn't take his gaze off Jerome. He didn't want to look at Brent's crushed ruin of a face again. "Cut the bullshit, Starkey. You're not going to kill me. If you wanted me dead, you'd have offed me while I was out of it." Pat hoped he sounded more confident of his reasoning than he felt. "It would have been easier that way," Jerome admitted, "but a lot less fun." Jerome's smile widened, and for an instant Pat thought his teeth were yellow and crooked, thrusting forth from dry, scarred gums. But then his teeth looked normal again, though his smile remained just as unsettling. It was the kind of smile a predator gave to its prey right before taking the first bite of flesh. "I didn't bother trying to conceal Eddie's murder. To be honest, it didn't even occur to me. But I figure I shouldn't be too hard on myself. After all, it was my first killing, and I'm sure I'll get better at it as I go. If you wouldn't mind, I'd appreciate it if you could give me some constructive feedback on my latest attempts." Jerome pointed to the El Dorado, and although it was a bit of a strain for Pat to see at this angle, the rag sticking out of the car's open gas tank was clear enough. "There's another cloth sticking out of your car's trunk," Jerome said. Then he held up his hand and showed Pat the disposable lighter that he held. All pretense of being a tough guy vanished when Pat understood what Jerome had in mind. "Please, man, don't do it. I'll never bother you again, I fucking swear. I'll leave Elle alone, too, and I won't so much as look in Cheryl's direction, let alone ever talk to her again." Jerome looked at Pat thoughtfully for a moment, as if considering his offer. Finally, he said, "Tempting, Pat, but I'm afraid it falls under the heading of too little, too late." He flicked the lighter, and a small yellow-orange flame was born. Pat couldn't take his eyes off the tiny flickering flame. "Please!" Tears began to roll down his cheeks, but he was completely unaware of crying them. "As much as I enjoy hearing you beg, I'm afraid the answer is, no." Jerome grinned. "Time to flame on, Pat!" Jerome moved away from the window and started walking down the length of the Camaro toward the location of the gas tank opening. "Damn you, Starkey!" Pat pulled and yanked and thrashed in his seat, but no matter how violent his attempts, he couldn't loosen the knots in the seatbelt that bound his wrists together and kept him tied to the Camaro's steering wheel. He then saw Jerome run to the El Dorado's gas tank and light the rag protruding from its fuel tank opening. As soon as the cloth caught fire, Jerome ran like hell away from the pair of wrecked cars. "Starkey!" And then his universe became a maelstrom of noise and heat and pain that lasted far too long, before finally being replaced by blessed, numbing darkness. Jerome, or rather the personality in control of his body, stood several dozen yards away, ears still ringing from the explosion of the two gas tanks, and watched the Camaro and El Dorado burn. The flames looked quite beautiful, contrasted against the night sky. Jerome doubted he would ever see anything so lovely again. When the flames had finally burned down a bit, Jerome started to walk back toward the two cars, or rather, what was left of them. Only one last detail to attend to. Though the heat was so intense that he felt the skin on his face start to burn, Jerome did not hesitate. He extended his left hand and thrust it into the flames. The pain was excruciatingly delicious, but he didn't cry out. When he felt like he'd cooked his hand enough, he withdrew it from the fire and backed away from the cars. He sought out an appropriate spot in the ditch, not too close to the fire, but not so far away as to make it look unlikely that he was thrown there by the collision of the two vehicles. He then went to that spot, lay down, and waited for the first of the emergency vehicles to arrive, luxuriating in the agony of his burned hand to keep himself entertained while he waited. Chapter 15. Jerome sat slumped on the couch, bandaged left hand resting on a pillow, right hand holding the cable remote. He had his thumb firmly pressed on the channel up button, and the image on the TV screen changed every few seconds. It didn't matter what came on, though. It all sucked. TV was lame enough as it was, but daytime TV was the absolute pits. Nothing but soap operas, talk shows, kiddie cartoons, reruns of moldy old sitcoms, and bland reporters yakking away on dull news programs. When he'd been little, staying home sick from school had been a real treat, provided he wasn't too sick. It was only 2:30 in the afternoon, but he felt as if he'd been stuck at home for at least a week. It didn't help matters that he'd been awake since he'd returned to full awareness to find himself being treated by a paramedic at the scene of last night's accident. It looked like his hand wouldn't require surgery, but it still hurt like a motherfucker. But he refused to take the pain pills that the ER physician had prescribed for him. Drowsiness was one of the medication's side effects, and the last thing he wanted to do was sleep, not with Freddy Krueger waiting for him in the dream realm. In a way, he supposed he was grateful for the pain. It definitely helped him stay awake. That and the entire pot of coffee he'd consumed since this morning. He had a second pot brewing in the kitchen currently. Both his dad and Lynn had offered to stay home from work to take care of him. But though he would have appreciated the company, even Lynn's, he told them he'd be fine. He was 17 after all. He didn't need anyone to stay home and babysit him, as much as he might have wanted someone to. Both his father and stepmother had called several times to check on him. But though the calls made him feel a little less lonely, whatever cheering effect they had was temporary, gone almost as soon as he hung up. He wished Cheryl was here, but after sitting with him all night in the hospital she'd been exhausted, and Jerome had insisted she go home and get some sleep. He thought about calling her, but he didn't want to wake her up. He could wait for her to call him, though it wouldn't be easy. As he continued flipping through the channels, his mind wandered, and he remembered being questioned by a police officer in the hospital. "When did you first become aware that you were being followed by another car?" And, "You already told me about the incident with Pat Cottrell in detention. Can you think of any other reason he might have wanted to run you off the road?" And there was always when he said, "That's a nasty burn. I suppose the car was already on fire when you came to, is that correct? Were you aware that Eddie Jackson was killed earlier this evening near where you work? To the best of your knowledge, did Pat Cottrell or Brent Haney have some sort of disagreement with Eddie?" Talking with the police had been awkward to say the least, considering that Jerome had only hazy, fragmentary memories of what his other self had done while in control of his, their body. Jerome had understood one thing well enough. His alter ego had rigged the scene to look like nothing more than a simple car accident that only he had been fortunate enough to survive. Evidently, the other Jerome had done an effective enough job of staging the scene, for the police had bought it and let Jerome go home. Elle's mom and dad were less than thrilled that Jerome had totaled their son's car, but Elle himself was not angry. The damn thing was a gas hog anyway, he told Jerome when he'd called from the hospital. "I'm just glad you're okay. And I might be a cold-hearted son of a bitch for saying this, But I'm not exactly going to shed a tear for Pat or Brent, you know. As Jerome continued to watch the ever-changing kaleidoscope of images on the TV, he realized that he'd gotten away with murder. 3 of them, as a matter of fact. Intellectually, he knew he should feel remorse or regret. Something. But emotionally, he didn't feel much of anything beyond a certain satisfaction that the 3 Pusketeers would never bother him or anyone else ever again. Besides, he hadn't killed them. His other self had. Well, maybe, but he had willingly turned over control to his alter ego, had let the beast out of the cage to do his dirty work for him, so to speak. Even if he hadn't been conscious and in control when Pat and the others had been killed, he still shared at least partial responsibility. So why didn't he give a damn? He remembered Freddy cutting him open during the dream in Miss LeClaire's office. Remembered Krueger jamming his claw knives into his gut and pulling forth a blood-covered cricket, as if he were some diabolical version of Little Jack Horner. In the dream, Freddy claimed to have removed Jerome's conscience. Was such a thing possible? Had the undead madman somehow performed a kind of psychic surgery on him? The TV suddenly displayed the image of a bald man sitting behind a news desk, and Jerome lifted his thumb off the channel up button. Not because he was a big fan of news, but because the man's suit had green and red stripes. His tie was brown, and his skin was a wrinkled, puckered mass of scar tissue. He was looking at Freddy Krueger.
Welcome to the afternoon newscast here on WDED, where we're all dead, all the time!
Freddy shuffled papers lying in front of him, the blades of his claw gloves scratching the wooden surface of the desk and leaving long, thin gouges.
Today's top story. Last night, local teen Jerome Starkey upped his overall body count to 3. When asked how he felt about his achievement, Jerome had this to say.
The picture of Freddy sitting behind a news desk was replaced with one of Jerome. From the dark sky and the flashing red and blue light of nearby emergency vehicles, the footage had obviously been shot at the scene of last night's accident. And while local news crews had arrived shortly on the heels of police and rescue crews, Jerome had no memory of anyone shoving a camera in his face or asking him questions. Stranger yet, the Jerome on TV looked younger than he did. That Jerome was 10, maybe 12 at the most. "I had a lot of time killing these 3 fuckers," young Jerome said in a voice too cold to belong to a child. "I'm looking forward to killing again, and again, and again, and..." The picture switched back to Freddy.
Looks like your inner child had a real growth spurt, huh, Jerome?
Jerome looked around. The living room appeared the same as always. He pushed down on the couch cushion with his good hand. It felt real enough. But if Krueger was on TV, and talking directly to him no less, then this couldn't be real. He must have fallen asleep on the couch without realizing it. "Wake up," he told himself. "Wake up now." Krueger's laughter was as brittle as the sound of snapping cartilage.
Do you really think you're the first person to try waking yourself? Once you're in my world, it's not that easy to get out.
"What do you want?"
"Just to congratulate you, Jerome. You bagged a 2 for last night. And that's on top of doing Eddie in the alley earlier in the day. A grand total of 3. Not bad at all for your first day as a homicidal maniac."
I didn't kill anyone. He did. The TV picture blurred, and when it came back into focus, Freddy was dressed in his fedora and sweater once more. He stood in front of the burning wreckage of Pat's Camaro and Elle's Eldorado. Standing beside Krueger, his head reaching almost to the bastard's shoulder, was the other Jerome. He was dressed just as the real Jerome had been last night, though his clothes were sized to fit his smaller frame. His left hand wasn't bandaged, but it had obviously been burned. The skin was red and blistered, clear serum running from open fissures.
"By he, I assume you mean this charming young lad."
Freddy put his hand on the younger Jerome's shoulder and gave him an affectionate, almost fatherly look.
"If you want to be technical about it, I suppose you're right. But before too much longer, there won't be 2 of you anymore. There'll just be 1.
Freddy patted young Jerome's shoulder.
"This one."
The boy gazed up at the scar-faced lunatic with dark adoration. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jerome demanded.
"During our little fishing trip, I told you that I decided to create a son. What I didn't tell you was why. You've learned by now how the adults of Springwood have tried to make all my children forget about me in order to weaken my power and ultimately isolate me in the dreamscape and render me harmless.
Freddy looked as if he almost choked on this last word. Yeah, Jerome acknowledged. So
if I have a son who can operate in the physical world for me, he can make sure that no one ever forgets the name Freddy Krueger. Not only will I stay strong, I'll be even more powerful, because thanks to Junior here, I'll be able to terrorize both the dream world and the physical world. We'll be an unstoppable team, father and son, wreaking havoc on two separate planes of existence.
Krueger roared with laughter, and the young Jerome joined him, his voice a close match to his father's. What makes you think I'll help you? Jerome said. Now that I know what your game is, I'll never let him have control of my body again.
That threat would have carried a lot more weight yesterday, when Junior was still just a squirming little fetus. But he's grown since then, grown strong enough to resist you. You won't be able to stop him from taking control of your body to kill again. And with each death, Jerome, he'll grow increasingly stronger, until he's able to remain in control of your body, his body, forever.
Jerome felt a cold wave of fear ripple through him. If his other self assumed control of his body, what would happen to his original personality? What would happen to him? I'll stop you, Krueger. I don't know how, but I swear I'll find a way. Young Jerome fixed his gaze on his older counterpart on the other side of the television screen. You can't stop me, bro, because I'm part of you. I'm going to replace you bit by bit, just like cancer cells replace healthy tissue, until there's nothing of the original Jerome Starkey left. And now that the process has begun, there isn't a damn thing you can do about it. Young Jerome walked toward the TV screen until his nose was almost against the glass. He reached up and pressed his fingers to the other side of the screen and pushed. The screen bowed under the pressure of his hand and began to bulge outward. But maybe I won't wait, young Jerome said, his voice louder, fuller, more real, as if he weren't inside the TV, but actually present in the room. Maybe I'll just take over your body right now. He continued pushing against the other side of the screen, and it continued to bow outward, the spot where his fingers touched stretching and growing thin, as if the screen was made of rubber being stretched close to the breaking point. Jerome knew he had to do something fast, even though this was one of Freddy's nightmares. If his other self got out of the TV and attacked, it could all be over for him. He knew he couldn't simply will himself awake. He'd tried that earlier without any success, but there had to be another way. The rubbery surface of the bulging TV screen had grown so thin that the tips of young Jerome's fingers were starting to break through. There was a sudden tearing sound, and a ragged tear opened along the vertical length of the screen. The substance of the screen resembled flesh more than glass now, and blood gushed from the tear and splattered onto the Starkeys' living room carpet. Like some hideous mockery of birth, young Jerome withdrew his hand and thrust his head through the slit he'd created, smearing his face and hair with blood. Jerome glanced at his bandaged hand, and he knew what he had to do. He raised it off the pillow and lifted it over his head. He leaned forward and brought his burned hand down fast and hard on the surface of the coffee table. The pain that exploded in his hand was excruciating, beyond anything he'd ever known, but it did the job. Jerome cried out in agony and opened his eyes. He sat on the edge of the couch, his bandaged hand resting on the coffee table, the cloth wet with pus from burst blisters. The TV screen was smooth, flat, and unbroken. No longer did it show Freddy and Jerome's other self. Instead, a nature documentary was playing, and some enthusiastic Australian in khaki shorts was going on and on about dung beetles. Jerome did his best to ignore the pain in his burned hand while he searched for the remote. He found it on the floor by his feet and decided he must have dropped it there when he'd fallen asleep. He reached down, picked it up, and turned off the TV, just as the Australian naturalist was about to demonstrate how dung beetles had come by their charming appellation. Jerome then laid the remote down on the coffee table. He'd had enough TV to last him for a while. He leaned back on the couch and gritted his teeth while he waited for the pain in his hand to subside. That had been a close one. He was going to have to do everything he could to keep from falling asleep. He might not be so lucky next time. After several minutes, the pain had lessened to the point where Jerome could tolerate it. He started to rise off the couch, intending to go see if the new pot of coffee was finished brewing yet, and maybe change his bandage, when the phone rang. The handheld unit was on the coffee table where he'd left it after the last time his dad had called. Hoping it was Cheryl, he started to reach for it, but then stopped as a thought occurred to him. What if the dream wasn't over? What if he only thought he'd woken up? What if it was Freddy on the other line calling to taunt him further? The phone continued to ring, and though Jerome knew it was probably his imagination, its electronic warbling sounded increasingly insistent. He hesitated for several moments, trying to decide what to do, hoping that while he debated whoever or whatever was calling would give up and disconnect. But the phone just kept ringing. This was exactly what Krueger wanted, Jerome realized, to keep him off balance and doubting himself, doubting his own sanity. Well, Jerome wasn't going to play that game. He picked up the phone and thumbed the talk button. Hello? He was both surprised and pleased at how steady his voice sounded. In your dog meat face, Krueger. Jerome, this is Aunt Becca. How are you doing? Jerome relaxed and started walking toward the kitchen to check on the coffee. I'm all right. My hand hurts, but I'm sure you didn't need your psychic powers to tell you that. As he entered the kitchen, he smelled the rich scents of freshly brewed coffee and inhaled deeply. He loved the smell of coffee much more than he loved the taste, but he wasn't drinking the stuff for its flavor. Not today. Becca chuckled at his joke, but it sounded strained, as if she didn't really mean it. Everything else going okay? I asked because I just had a strong feeling that you were in some sort of trouble, Jerome. Jerome got a clean mug from the cupboard, one with a picture of a kitten dangling from a tree branch by its front paws above the caption, Hang in there, baby. As he poured hot coffee into the mug, he considered lying to Becca, but he doubted he could pull it off. Besides, if he'd never quite fully believed in Becca's powers, after the last couple nights he'd experienced too much of the shadowy world that lay hidden behind what he'd always thought as a reality to ever automatically doubt anything again. As he leaned against the kitchen counter and waited for his coffee to cool to the point where he could drink it, he told her everything. About what had happened in the alley, about the accident last night, and about the dream he'd just had. He was sketchy on some of the details since his personality hadn't been in control when the events in question occurred, but he was able to tell her enough. After he was finished, Becca didn't reply right away. Her silence made Jerome nervous, but he sensed it was best to give her a bit of time to think. He took advantage of the lull in the conversation to take a gulp of coffee. It was still too hot, and it burned his tongue and throat as he swallowed, but he didn't care, as long as it helped keep him awake. He was afraid of what Becca was going to say. Would she think him weak for not being able to resist Krueger? Worse, would she tell him that this other self crap was nonsense? That there was only one him and that he alone was responsible for the deaths of the 3 Musketeers? When Becca finally spoke once more, her voice was filled with sympathy. I'm sorry, Jerome. You must feel awful about everything that's happened. Jerome smiled with relief. He should have known his aunt would stand by him no matter what. Becca went on. If only I'd managed to repair your dream catcher last night. Becca had succeeded in putting the pieces back together while Jerome had been out playing demolition derby with Pat and Brent. But, as she told him earlier this morning at the hospital, whatever power the object had once held was gone. She'd brought the dream catcher to show to him. Jerome hadn't been able to see any difference from the way it was before, but he'd thought he'd understood what Becca had been talking about. The dream catcher had felt lifeless, fragile, and brittle, as if it really was what it appeared to be, nothing more than a patched-together conglomeration of wood, leather straps, feathers, and beads. You shouldn't blame yourself, Becca, Jerome said. You had nothing to do with Krueger choosing me to adopt. You're not only my nephew, you're my sister's only child. After Joanna died, I made a vow to her spirit that I would always protect you, and I failed you. I failed her. Jerome was the one Krueger was stalking, the one whose body he wanted to steal and give to his evil little dream clone. But despite that, at the moment, all Jerome was concerned about was comforting his aunt. You did the best you could, better than anyone else could have. You kept Krueger away from me for 17 years. And if I hadn't been dumb enough to lose my temper and throw my shoe at the dream catcher, I might have been safe my whole life because of you. He could hear Becca's smile in her voice as she replied, It's sweet of you to try and make me feel better. But we need to take care of you right now. I took your dream catcher apart once I got home, and I've been playing around with the pieces. I've consulted various reference books I have, and I've surfed the net and sent some emails to friends of mine in the psychic community. And I've posted some questions on message boards. I'm not sure, but I think I found a way to, if not exactly fix your dream catcher, then recycle it. After showing Jerome that her repair job had been a failure, Becca had taken the dream catcher back home with her to continue working on it. At the time, she hadn't sounded very confident in her ability to find a solution. But it seemed she'd actually come up with something. The question was, what? Jerome frowned. I don't understand. That's okay. You don't need to right now. I still have some work to do before I'm finished. But come over here around 6 and I'll show you what I've got. Make sure to have someone else drive you. In your sleep-deprived state, you'd only end up getting into an accident. You mean another accident? This time Becca didn't even attempt to fake a chuckle at his joke. He supposed he couldn't blame her. It wasn't a very good one. All right, I'll see if Dad will lend me his car and I'll ask Cheryl to drive me to you. But why do we have to go to your place? Couldn't you just bring whatever it is over here? I could, Becca conceded, but Krueger's already established a strong psychic foothold at your house. The spiritual environment at my home is much stronger, the result of years of my working to build psychic shields against Krueger and other evil forces. She paused then, and when she resumed speaking, she didn't sound quite as confident as she had a moment ago. My defenses are far from perfect, but right now, they're all we have. Whatever you say, Becca, I'll be there at 6. Good. Now try to get some rest, but don't fall asleep. Jerome finished the rest of his coffee in 2 swallows and refilled his mug. You can count on it. Chapter 16. Becca put the handheld receiver down on her reading table. She had pushed the crystal ball off to one side, and bits and pieces salvaged from Jerome's dream catcher lay spread out before her on the new tablecloth, a replacement for the one that Krueger had burnt. So the situation was even worse than she'd feared. Krueger wasn't simply trying to kill Jerome, as awful as that would have been. He wanted to replace him with a creature of his own making. Jerome needed her help now more than ever. She only hoped she'd prove up to the task. She'd been at the hospital most of the night with Dawn, Lynn, and the kids, first waiting to see how serious Jerome's injuries would turn out to be, and then worrying of what charges, if any, the police might bring against him. It was only once Becca was certain Jerome was going to be all right, both medically and legally, that she returned home to continue working on his dream catcher. She'd meditated and researched, and she thought she finally had the answer, if she could find the courage to try it. She'd want you to do it, Becca told herself. You know she would. Becca sighed and nodded, though no one was there to see the gesture. Then she reached for a small piece of carved wood and began working. Despite her earlier misgivings, her hand moved with a surgeon's dexterity and confidence, and a half-hour later she was finished. She had taken the pieces she'd saved from the dream catcher, pieces that still held a slight residue of mystic power, and fashioned them into a smaller version, about the size of a $50. She added a leather thong to the miniature dream catcher and tied it off to make a loop. Jerome's dream catcher, or at least what was left of it, had become a medallion. She placed it gently, almost reverently, on the table, then put her hands palm down on either side of it. She then closed her eyes and focused her awareness on the medallion, or more accurately on the energy that it contained. At first she felt nothing, and she feared that she'd failed. But just as she was about to withdraw her awareness and open her eyes, she sensed it. An echo, a whisper, the merest suggestion of the power the dream catcher had once contained. But it was there, and it was real. She was sure of it. She didn't know if it would be enough for what she had in mind, but since it was all she'd been able to salvage from the original dream catcher, it would have to do. Becca let her hands remain where they were and kept her eyes closed. Only, instead of training her awareness on the medallion, she refocused it, split it in two, and directed one half inward and the other half outward. She was searching for a doorway, a very special one, that existed simultaneously at the core of every being's soul and farther away than the outermost star in the galactic perimeter. As she searched for the doorway, she continued to breathe slowly and evenly, her body relaxing a bit more with each exhalation. As tired as she was, it was tempting to allow herself to drift off to sleep. But Becca was well experienced in meditation and trance techniques, and she knew how to keep both her mind and body relaxed without allowing them to succumb to the need for rest. Besides, falling asleep at this juncture could well prove suicidal, considering who she was fighting against. After a time, she became less and less conscious of her physical self, and though she knew her body remained seated at the table, eyes closed, lungs breathing, heart pumping, she could no longer feel it. It was at this point that most inexperienced astral travelers panicked and returned to their bodies. But Becca had done this a time or two before, and she pushed past the rising panic, the horrible feeling of being cut off from one's body and lost in the immaterial realms for all eternity. She toughed it out long enough for the fear to subside, and when it was gone, she would have let out a sigh of relief if she'd still fully inhabited her physical form. Then she became completely free and unfettered, able to roam the astral plane at will. It wasn't a realm of the physical senses, so there weren't any sights, sounds, tastes, touches, or smells here. Instead, there were feelings, impressions, seemingly random thoughts and emotions so intense that even the most pleasant of them burned the spirit like fire. Movement here was simply a matter of will. You decided where you wanted to go, concentrated on that place, and you were on your way. She concentrated on the doorway she was searching for, and after several moments, not that time held any objective reality in this place, she felt a gentle, pulling sensation toward one particular direction. She relaxed and allowed her spirit to be pulled toward it, and soon she sensed that she had reached her destination. She gave her spirit a moment to get used to this placeless place and opened her eyes, or rather, she imagined that she did. She was standing before a white door at the end of a long, narrow hallway, so long, in fact, that she couldn't see the other end of it, and she wondered if it had even had another end. The hall was illuminated by hovering globes of soft light, spaced at regular intervals near the ceiling. The globes were unattached to anything, and as Becca watched, she thought she could see the globes bobbing so slowly that their motion was all but imperceptible. The gentle glow of the lights revealed that the ceiling, walls, and floor of the hallway were just as white as the door. Even its hinges and knob appeared to have been fashioned from some manner of ivory-colored ceramic. Now that she was there, Becca was suddenly gripped by a fear that had nothing to do with Freddy Krueger. She was afraid of what lay on the other side of that door, afraid that if she opened it, which was exactly what she'd come here to do, she might be drawn inside and trapped forever. As a stalling tactic more than anything, she spent a few moments imagining herself a body. Not that she necessarily needed an avatar to operate on this plane, but since the door had manifested to her as a physical object, it only made sense that she adopt a physical semblance, if she intended to open it. Though she felt no different than she had upon first entering this realm, she looked down, and saw that she indeed did have a body, and it was wearing the same blouse and jeans she'd had on back on the earthly plane. Seeing her clothing made her feel a bit more solid, though she still felt no physical sensation. She reached out a hand that she knew was just an abstract concept in a place constructed from concepts far more abstract, took hold of the white door's knob, turned it, and slowly opened the door. As wide as the hallway was, it was nothing compared to the light that poured through the open doorway. It was like looking into the white-hot heart of a blazing star. And though the light didn't cause Becca pain exactly, its intensity threatened to overwhelm her, to force her back from the open doorway and avert her gaze from the flood of illumination. And once she did that, she knew her connection to the door would be severed, and her spirit would be instantly yanked back to her true body, like a stretched-tight rubber band that was suddenly released at one end. It took all of her mental and spiritual strength, all of the experience she'd gained during a lifetime of having her psychic abilities, but she did not turn away from its light. Though the light did not diminish, it became easier to bear, and soon Becca became aware of a figure coming toward her from the center of the light. It seemed to take the figure a long time to draw near, as if it had to cross a great distance to reach the open doorway. Becca tensed as the figure came closer, prepared to find herself faced with one of Freddy Krueger's cruel tricks. But just before the figure reached the doorway, its features resolved into those of a young woman, a woman Becca hadn't seen in 17 years. And she relaxed. "Hi, sis," Joanna said with a sad smile. "I wish I could say that it's good to see you." At first, Becca couldn't reply. She was too overwhelmed with emotion upon being reunited with her lost twin. But the sisters had work to do, and Becca knew they couldn't afford to waste time chatting. There was no telling how much longer they'd have before Freddy became aware of what Becca was up to, and came to stop her. "Then you know why I'm here." Joanna nodded. "It's a long shot. It might not work, and it might even make things worse." "I know," Becca said, "but it may well turn out to be the only chance Jerome has." At the mention of her son's name, Joanna's eyes filled with equal measures of love and sorrow. "Of course. Let's do it." Joanna held out her hand, palm up, and Becca reached out and, though her own hand had been empty but a second before, gently placed the Dreamcatcher medallion in her sister's grasp. Joanna looked down at the miniature hoop of wood, string, and feathers for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she cupped her other hand over the medallion, and a soft glow began to pulse, its light visible through the spaces between her fingers. The rhythmic glow made Becca think of a heartbeat, except Joanna had no more physical reality in this place than she had. A soul beat, then? The ebb and flow of power that made up the complex pattern of energies that resulted in consciousness? After several moments, the glow became dimmer, its pulse weaker, until finally it extinguished altogether. Joanna looked into her sister's eyes once more, and Becca was shocked to see that her twin appeared transparent and out of focus, as if she were having trouble maintaining the illusion of physical form. Or worse, that her spiritual energies had been severely depleted. Joanna held the medallion out to Becca, and the psychic reached to take it. The miniature dreamcatcher still seemed solid enough, in a metaphysical sense, but when Becca's fingertips brushed her sister's, instead of touching them, Becca's fingers passed through Joanna's as if she held no more substance than mist. "I've given all I can," Joanna said, her voice so soft that Becca had to lip-read to make out her sister's words. "It's up to you now, and to Jerome. When you see him again, tell him. Joanna's features blurred and her lips were no longer visible. Her voice was little more than the merest hint of a whisper, too soft and faint for Becca to understand. But that didn't matter. She knew what message her sister wanted to pass on to her child. "I'll tell him, Joanna." And as if Becca's words granted her spirit release, what little remained of Joanna's form collapsed into particles of light which were instantly absorbed by the sea of illumination on the other side of the open doorway. Becca stood alone, holding the medallion and being grateful that she had no physical body in this place, else she would be bawling like a baby right now. But she couldn't afford to linger there and wallow in emotion. She needed to get the medallion, and the power Joanna had infused in it, back home. With her free hand she closed the white door, then turned to head back down the hallway, the way she had come. But she'd only taken a single step when 4 razor-sharp claws thrust upward through the door. She was too late. Krueger had found her. The dreamscape was located at a dimensional tangent to the astral plane, but she'd hoped Krueger wouldn't sense her presence here in time for him to find a passageway from one realm to the other. From appearances, it seemed that he hadn't been able to locate such a passage, so he was making one by brute force. Becca couldn't comprehend the amount of sheer mystical power such a feat required, but if she had been frightened of Freddy Krueger before, she was absolutely terrified of the fiend now. Freddy continued slashing the floor with his claws, sweeping them back and forth in broad, violent strokes. Becca knew it would only take him seconds to cut his way through, so if she intended to act, she had to do so at once. She started running down the hall toward Krueger, and when she reached the spot where he was cutting his way into the dimension, she jumped over his claw knives. They swiped at her feet, barely missing her. She landed on the other side and kept running, not bothering to take so much as an instant to revel in avoiding Krueger's strike. She still had a long way to go before she could start celebrating.
"Come back here, bitch, and I promise to make your death slightly less agonizing,"
Krueger roared with dark laughter. But Becca didn't turn around to look at him. She could well imagine that he'd cut himself a hole large enough to crawl through and was pulling himself up into the hallway. Becca tried not to think about Krueger, about what the monster would do to her if he caught her, about what would happen to Jerome if she failed to bring the medallion charged with Joanna's spiritual energy back to the physical world. Instead, she concentrated on running, on putting one foot down while raising the other, on fleeing down the hallway as fast as she could.
"Come on, Becca. Didn't your mommy ever tell you that you can't run away from your problems?"
From the corners of her eyes, Becca saw movement on either side of her. She was so startled that she forgot to keep her gaze fixed forward, and she glanced to her right. She saw Krueger's gloved right hand, claws and all, right next to her face. She turned to her left and saw his other hand, uncovered, flesh a mass of wrinkled, discolored scar tissue.
"Gotcha!"
Freddy shouted from what sounded like a long way behind her, and then his hands grabbed Becca's shoulders. She screamed as the hands yanked her backwards, and momentum caused her feet to slide out from under her. If Krueger's hands hadn't been holding on to her, she surely would have fallen. But the hands held her upright, so tight it hurt. But she didn't fall. She hadn't been cut either. Freddy had grabbed her in such a way as to make sure his claw knives didn't harm her. At least, not yet. Krueger's hands lifted her in their powerful grip and held her several feet above the floor. She thrashed, shook, kicked, but nothing she did would break his hold.
"I could say, 'Tag, you're it,'"
Freddy said, for some reason still sounding far away.
"but I'm not in the mood to stretch out our little game any longer than necessary."
The way he stressed the words stretch and longer aroused Becca's curiosity, and she glanced back over her shoulder. Krueger was coming toward her down the hallway, walking at a slow, unhurried pace. His arms stretched forth from the sockets like gigantic red and green striped serpents, thick and boneless, extending all the way to her, at least 50 feet, maybe more.
"You heard of the long arm of the law," Krueger said. "Well, I'm the long arm of the claw."
He turned Becca around to face him, his arms withdrawing back into their sockets to take up the slack as he continued to walk toward her.
"You thought you were so damn clever, reworking the Dreamcatcher into a protective medallion, and then paying a visit to your dead mess of a sister to get her to power the fucking thing. But you're too late, Miss Psychic. My Jerome's a big boy now, and he's getting bigger by the second. Soon he'll be strong enough to resist your pathetic little souvenir. My aunt traveled to the land of the dead, and all I got was this lousy medallion."
Krueger laughed once more, and the sound slammed into Becca like a physical blow. This close, she saw Krueger as two overlapping images. One was his normal manifestation, the scar-faced boogeyman clown in his Christmas-colored sweater, old-fashioned hat, and homemade claws. But the other image, the deeper, truer image, was far worse. For beneath his manic exterior lay a darkness beyond anything that Becca had ever conceived of. It wasn't simply evil, though it was that, evil with a capital E. And it wasn't just madness and bloodlust, rage and cruelty, though of course these were all present, and in great abundance. It was as if Krueger was a repository of every negative emotion that human beings were capable of feeling, every dark imagining and twisted thought, every blasphemous word and wicked deed. As if he'd read her mind, Krueger said,
"Dreams may be my mind's playground, but nightmares are its trash heap. All the rotten gunk sticking up people's psyches, their fears and hatreds, their loathing of themselves and others. It all gets purged in nightmares and left behind in the dreamscape, where it just sits and festers, waiting for some evil son of a bitch like me to come along and put it to use."
Freddy had already reached her. A few more feet and his arms would have returned to their normal length. Becca didn't know what would happen then, but she's sure it wouldn't be good.
"That's why you can't beat me, Becca. No one can. Because as long as people have bad dreams, I'll have an unlimited supply of power."
The dark energy that Krueger radiated was so strong that Becca felt she might be swept away by it, her essence torn to shreds by his psychic maelstrom. She fought to hold on to her identity, to her sense of self, for it was the only weapon she had to fight with. That may be true," she said in a shaky voice that became stronger as she went, "but it's not the whole truth. People purge their darkness because they want to get rid of it, to forget it, just like they want to forget about you. And once they do, you no longer have any connection to their dreams, no way to get at them, and then all your power is meaningless. What's a killer without a victim? A nightmare without a dreamer? Nothing. That's what. That's your deep, dark secret, Freddy Krueger. Beneath your demonic clown exterior, beneath even the accumulated darkness of all the nightmare energies you've managed to absorb, you're nothing.
and you know it."
As she spoke, Krueger's face changed. His scorched flesh took on a crimson hue, and his ears tapered to points. His brow became more pronounced and furrowed into a deep scowl. His lips curled back into a feral snarl. His teeth no longer crooked and yellow, but instead ivory fangs that wouldn't have been out of place in a shark's mouth. His eyes withdrew into their sockets and became red pinpoints that blazed like fire.
"Let's cut to the chase, sister."
Krueger's voice was deeper, like more than an animalistic growl without the slightest trace of humor, mocking or otherwise.
"I've caught you, and I'm going to destroy your little mystic talisman. Then I'm going to torture you until your soul screams throughout all existence for release. And there's not a goddamn thing you can do about it."
Paradoxically, because Krueger had revealed his true face to her, Becca was no longer quite so frightened of him. The greatest fear was fear of the unknown, but she knew what Krueger was, and while that didn't make him any less dangerous, it made him something that could be fought. Becca smiled. "There's one thing I can do. When you first appeared, I was so scared that I forgot where I was, and what I really am here. This isn't the physical world, and it's not the dreamscape. You've wandered too far from your center of power, Krueger, and you can't hold me here, not if I don't wish to be held." Becca closed her eyes and thought a single word: home. She felt a sudden rush as if the ground had opened up beneath her, and she now plunged rapidly through empty space. She more sensed than heard Krueger shout, "No!" And then she opened her eyes. Becca was looking down at the top of her reading table, palms flat against the surface, the recycled Dreamcatcher medallion resting between them. She wanted to shout in triumph over her escape from Krueger, but she couldn't afford to lose control, not yet. She had one more task to perform. She turned her hands upward until each palm faced the medallion. She then concentrated on releasing the spiritual energy Joanna had given her and directing it into the medallion. Becca had carried a simulacrum of the medallion on the astral plane, but it had only been a metaphorical construct designed to represent the true transfer that was now taking place. She felt the energy leaving her and infusing the medallion, holding with the remnants of mystical power that lingered in the pieces Becca had salvaged from the original Dreamcatcher, and strengthening them. But it wasn't enough. Becca had to contribute a significant portion of her own life force, and she felt her life energy draining from her body and entering the medallion. Within moments the transfer was complete, and Becca slumped back in her chair, suddenly overwhelmed by a sense of weariness and loss. Having Joanna's energy inside her had been like having Joanna herself back, alive and vital. The psychic link they had shared as twins once more present and strong. Transferring the energy into the medallion created a void inside Becca, one so painful it felt as if she'd lost her sister all over again, and it had also taken another toll on her. Tears began to trickle down her newly wrinkled face, but she didn't try to fight them. They were tears of relief as much as loss. Everything was going to be all right now, just as soon as Jerome got here and put the medallion on. He'd be protected then, by the loving power of his own mother's spirit. He'd be safe at last. She hoped. Hands that now shook as if palsied resting in her lap, roomy gaze fixed firmly on the Dreamcatcher medallion. Becca waited for Jerome and Cheryl to arrive. Freddy Krueger stood upon the dreamscape, its dark energy swirling and rolling around him in a constantly shifting riot of color and form. This chaos was the dreamscape's natural state, and though Freddy took great delight in the deadly scenarios he created for his playmates from these energies, he much preferred this maelstrom of madness. It was his kind of place. But at the moment he was too busy seething with frustrated rage to enjoy the insanity that surrounded him. The psychic bitch's words echoed in the diseased lump of rotten flesh that passed for Krueger's mind. "That's your deep dark secret, Freddy Krueger, beneath your demonic clown exterior, beneath even the accumulated darkness of all the nightmares, energies you've managed to absorb. You're nothing, and you know it."
"Thought you were pretty slick escaping me like that, didn't you, Becca? And now you think you're safe out there, in the physical world. Think I can't touch you there?"
He flexed the fingers in his claw glove, and the metal blades hissed against one another.
"But I've got a longer reach than you think, bitch. And it's getting longer. All the time."
Dark laughter bubbled from Krueger's throat and echoed throughout the length and breadth of the dreamscape. All across the face of the earth, sleepers shivered beneath their blankets in fear. And when they awakened, they would remember only that they'd had a terrible nightmare, and never again would they truly know a good night's rest. Okay, this has been chapters 14, 15, and 16 of A Nightmare on Elm Street Protege. I hope you're all enjoying this book as much as I am so far. It's really getting good. We're getting close to the end, actually. I only see about 2, maybe 3 more uploads before this book is finished. I want to thank everybody for listening. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe. Please, guys, I'm begging you to just take the time, click that like button. It means the world to me to see that you enjoy these videos. Also, if you don't mind, drop me a comment, give me some feedback, let me know what you think of the current story, just whatever's on your mind. I'd love to hear from you guys. Click the bell so you always know when new chapters are dropping. Please spread the word out on social media, Reddit, Facebook, just wherever. Let people know. I want to get out to as many fans as possible to let them know these books are available for everyone to experience for free. Alright, guys, I'll be back tomorrow with some Friday the 13th Hell Lake. And I'll be back the day after tomorrow with even more of A Nightmare on Elm Street Protege. Until then, this has been Storytime with your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian, saying thanks for listening and
pleasant dreams!